Alison. I'm the Programs Outreach and Youth Services Manager here at Monterey County Free Libraries. Thank you for joining me today for our Halloween reading. Today we are going to continue reading The Vacant Lot. If you tuned in last time, you will remember that the Townsends have just moved into a new house and they have discovered something strange happening on the vacant lot next door to their house. "My goodness," gasped Mrs. Townsend. Her face assumed a strange gathering of wrath in the midst of her terror. Suddenly she made a determined move forward, although her husband strove to hold her back. "You let me be," said she. She moved forward, then she recoiled and gave a loud shriek. "The wet sheet flapped in my face," she cried. "Take me away, take me away." Then she fainted. Between them, they got her back to the house. "It was awful," she moaned when she came to herself with the family all around her where she lay on the dining room floor. "Oh, David, what do you suppose it is?" "Nothing at all," replied David Townsend stoutly. He was remarkable for courage and staunch belief in actualities. He was now denying to himself that he had seen anything unusual. "Oh, there was," moaned his wife. "I saw something," said George, in a sullen, boyish bass. The maid sobbed convulsively, and so did Adriana for sympathy. "We won't talk about it," said David. "Here, Jane, you drink this hot tea. It will do you good. And Cordelia, you hang out the clothes in our own yard. George, you go and put up the line for her." "The line is out there," said George with a jerk of his shoulder. "Are you afraid?" "No, I ain't," replied the boy resentfully, and went out with a pale face. After that, Cordelia hung the Townsend wash in the yard of their own house, standing always with her back to the vacant lot. As for David Townsend, he spent a good deal of his time in the lot watching the shadows, but he came to no explanation, although he strove to satisfy himself with many. "I guess the shadows come from the smoke from our chimneys, or else the poplar tree," he said. "Why do the shadows come on Monday mornings and no other?" demanded his wife. David was silent. Very soon, new mysteries arose. One day, Cordelia rang the dinner bell at their usual dinner hour, the same as in Townsend Center, high noon, and the family assembled. With amazement, Adriana looked at the dishes on the table. "Why, that's strange," she said. "What's strange?" asked her mother. Cordelia stopped short as she was about setting a tumbler of water beside the plate, and the water slopped over. "Why," said Adriana, her face paling. I thought there was boiled dinner. I smelled cabbage cooking." "I knew there would be something else come up," gasped Cordelia, leaning hard on the back of Adriana's chair. "What do you mean?" asked Mrs. Townsend sharply, but her own face began to assume the shocked pallor which it was so easy nowadays for all their faces to assume at the merest suggestion of anything out of the common. "I smelt cabbage cooking all morning up in my room," Adriana said faintly, "and here's codfish and potatoes for dinner." The Townsends all looked at one another. David rose with an exclamation and rushed out of the room. The others waited tremblingly. When he came back, his face was lowering. "What did you—" Mrs. Townsend asked hesitantly. "There's some smell of cabbage out there," he admitted reluctantly. Then he looked her over with a challenge. "It comes from the next house," he said. "Blows over our house." "Our house is higher." "I don't care. You can never account for such things." "Cordelia," said Mrs. Townsend, "you go over to the next house and you ask if they've got cabbage for dinner." Cordelia switched out of the room, her mouth set hard. She came back promptly. "Says they never have cabbage," she announced with gloomy triumph and a conclusive glance at Mr. Townsend. "Their girl was real sassy." "Oh, Father, let's move away. Let's sell the house," cried Adriana in a panic-stricken tone. "If you think I'm going to sell a house that I got as cheap as this one because we smell cabbage in a vacant lot, you're mistaken," replied David firmly. "It isn't the cabbage alone," said Mrs. Townsend. "And a few shadows," added David. "I'm tired of such nonsense. I thought you had more sense, Jane." "One of the boys at school asked me if we lived in the house next to the vacant lot on Wells Street, and whistled when I said yes," remarked George. "Let him whistle," said Mr. Townsend. After a few hours, the family, stimulated by Mr. Townsend's calm, common sense, agreed that it was exceedingly foolish to be disturbed by a mysterious odor of cabbage. They even laughed at themselves. "I suppose we have got so nervous over those shadows hanging out clothes that we notice every little thing," conceded Mrs. Townsend. "You will find out someday that it is no more to be regarded than the cabbage," said her husband. "You can't account for that wet sheet hitting my face," said Mrs. Townsend doubtfully. "You imagined it." "I felt it." That afternoon, things went on as usual in the household until nearly 4 o'clock. Adriana went downtown to do some shopping. Mrs. Townsend sat sewing beside the bay window in her room, which was a front one in the 3rd story. George had not got home. Mr. Townsend was writing a letter in the library. Cordelia was busy in the basement. The twilight, which was coming earlier and earlier every night, was beginning to gather, when suddenly there was a loud crash which shook the house from its foundations. Even the dishes on the sideboard rattled, and the glasses rang like bells. The pictures on the walls of Mrs. Townsend's room swung out from the walls. But that was not all. Every looking glass in the house cracked simultaneously, as nearly as they could judge, from top to bottom, then shivered into fragments over the floors. Mrs. Townsend was too frightened to scream. She sat huddled in her chair, gasping for breath, her eyes rolling from side to side in incredulous terror, turned down the street. She saw a great black group of people crossing it just in front of the vacant lot. There was something inexpressibly strange and gloomy about this moving group. There was an effect of sweeping, wavings, and foldings of sable draperies and gleams of deadly white faces. Then they passed. She twisted her head to see, and they disappeared in the vacant lot. Mr. Townsend came hurrying into the room. He was pale and looked at once angry and alarmed. "Did you fall?" he asked inconsequently, as if his wife, who was small, could have produced such a manifestation by a fall. "Oh, David, what is it?" whispered Mrs. Townsend. "Darned if I know," said David. "Don't swear, it's too awful. Oh, see the looking-glass, David." "I see it. The one over the library mantel is broken, too." "Oh, it is a sign of death." Cordelia's feet were heard as she staggered on the stairs. She almost fell into the room. She reeled over to Mr. Townsend and clutched his arms. He cast a sideways glance, half furious, half commiserating at her. "Well, what is it all about?" he asked. "I don't know." "What is it? Oh, what is it? The looking-glass in the kitchen is broken, all over the floor. What is it?" "I don't know any more than you do. I didn't do it." "Looking-glass is broken as a sign of death in the house," said Cordelia. "If it's me, I hope I'm ready. But I'd rather die than be so scared as I've been lately." Mr. Townsend shook himself loose and eyed the two trembling women with gathering resolution. "Now look here, both of you," he said. "This is nonsense. You'll die sure enough of fright if you keep on this way. I was a fool myself to be startled. Everything it is an earthquake." "Oh, David," gasped his wife, not much reassured. "It is nothing but an earthquake," persisted Mr. Townsend. "It acted just like that. Things always are broken on the walls, and the middle of the room isn't affected. I've read about it." Suddenly, Mrs. Townsend gave a loud shriek and pointed. "How do you account for that?" she cried. "If it's an earthquake!" She was on the verge of hysterics. Her husband held her firmly by the arm as his eyes followed the direction of her rigid, pointing finger. Cordelia looked also. Her eyes seemingly converged to a bright point of fear. On the floor, in front of the broken looking-glass, lay a mass of black stuff and a gruesome long ridge. "It's something you dropped there." "It ain't." Mr. Townsend dropped his wife's arm and took one stride toward the object. It was a very long crepe veil. He lifted it, and it floated out from his arm, as if imbued with electricity. "It's yours," he said to his wife. "Oh, David, I never had one. You know. Oh, you know. I shouldn't unless you died. How came it there?" "I'm darned if I know," said David, regarding it. He was deadly pale, but still resentful rather than afraid. "Don't hold it, don't!" "I'd like to know what in the thunder all this means," said David. He gave the thing an angry toss, and it fell on the floor in exactly the same long heap as before. Cordelia began to weep with racking sobs. Mrs. Townsend reached out and caught her husband's hands, clutching it hard with ice-cold fingers. "What's got into this house, anyhow?" he growled. "You'll have to sell it. Oh, David, we can't live here." "As for my selling a house I paid only $5,000 for when it's worth $25, for any such nonsense as this, I won't." David gave one stride toward the black veil, but it rose from the floor and moved away before him across the room at exactly the same height, as if suspended from a woman's head. He pursued it, clutching vainly all around the room. Then he swung himself on his heel with an exclamation, and the thing fell to the floor again in a long heap. Then were heard hurrying feet on the stairs, and Adriana burst into the room. She ran straight to her father and clutched his arm. She tried to speak, but she chattered unintelligibly. Her face was blue. Her father shook her violently. "Adriana, do have more sense," he cried. "Oh, David, how can you talk so?" sobbed her mother. "I can't help it. I'm mad," he said with emphasis. "What has got into this house and you all anyhow?" "What is it, Adriana? Poor child," asked her mother. "Only look what has happened here." "It is an earthquake," said her father staunchly. "Nothing to be afraid of." "How do you account for that?" said Mrs. Townsend in an awful voice, pointing to the veil. Adriana did not look. She was too engrossed with her own terrors. She began to speak in a breathless voice. I was coming by the vacant lot, she panted, and I had my new hat in a paper bag and a parcel of blue ribbon, and I saw a crowd, a whole crowd of people with white faces as if they were dressed all in black. Where are they now? I don't know. Adriana sank gasping feebly into a chair. Get her some water, David, sobbed her mother. David rushed with an impatient exclamation out of the room and returned with a glass of water which he held to his daughter's lips. Here, drink this, he said roughly. Oh, David, how can you speak so? Sobbed his wife. I can't help it. I'm mad clean through, said David. Then there was a hard bound upstairs, and George entered. He was very white, but he grinned at them with an appearance of unconcern. Hello, he said in a shaking voice, when she tried to control. What on earth's to pay in that vacant lot now? Well, what is it? Demanded his father. Oh, nothing. Only, well, there are lights over it, exactly as if there was a house there, just about where the windows would be. It looked as if you could walk right in, but when you look close, there are those old dried-up weeds rattling away on the ground the same as ever. I looked at it and couldn't believe my eyes. A woman saw it, too. She came along just as I did. She gave one look, then she screeched and ran. I waited for someone else, but nobody came. Tune in next week for the final reading of The Vacant Lot.